Good evening, everybody. Good evening. One more time. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. All right, so my name is Ray Andrade. I am a former LMU student who now serves as your friendly programming librarian, a member of the Library Outreach Department, and it is my pleasure to welcome everybody on behalf of the entire library staff. And can I just say, wow, this might be the biggest opening night for Faculty Pub Night that we've ever had. So. We collected at least 85 RSVPs, so congratulations, you're part of the biggest opening audience ever, and I hear that extra credit might have something to do with it as well. Anyway, for today's event, we're going to be welcoming Assistant Professor of Psychology, Dr. Kayoko Okada, who's going to be talking about her recent project on fMRI study of American Sign Language. But before we begin tonight's event, just a few words about Faculty Pub Night. Students, we have a new deal going on where you're going to be swiping into this event. So if you didn't swipe in, please do so towards the end. But talk to staff in case you want to make sure that you get swiped in and you get credit for attending today's event. Secondly, the phrase Faculty Pub Night. As you figured out by now, it is not for faculty only, and it is not 21 and over. Our bartender will be checking IDs though, okay? So don't try to be slick, freshmen. So students, please spread the word about that, and also please follow us on social media. If you search LMU Library, you should be able to easily find us on basically any social media channel by now. Feedback forms. On your seats, you should have seen something that looks like this. If you fill it out and if you provide your email address, you will be entered into a raffle for a $100 Amazon gift card. Okay, might come in handy for half a book. So. Food and drinks, Faculty Pub Night. We want this to be a casual environment, so please, by all means, feel free to get any drinks or food during the middle of the event, okay? And with that, I'm going to begin the event formally. So here to introduce tonight's speaker is Dr. Brett Marroquin, Assistant Professor of Psychology. Brett.
Wow, that was great for an introducer. I'm here to introduce happily my colleague from the Department of Psychology in BCLA, Dr. Kayoko Okada. Dr. Okada is a cognitive neuroscientist in our department. She's a Southern California native who got her bachelor's at UC Irvine, and then her PhD at UC Irvine, and then did her postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Cognitive Sciences at UC Irvine. And somewhere in between there, got a master's at Johns Hopkins. So at least you've seen the East Coast. Dr. Okada's work involves neuroimaging methods to explore the neural bases of language and memory, specifically speech perception and production, including auditory and visual aspects of language processing. Her current projects, other than what she'll talk about today, involve perception and production of accents, different linguistic accents, and the effects of physical exercise on brain changes during learning, which is very appropriate because, as some of you know, she just finished an Ironman, 3 or 4 weeks ago in Canada, and was actually featured on the Canadian version of ESPN, she and her husband, Craig. So very cool. Today, she's going to be talking about perception and production of language in deaf signers and her application of fMRI techniques to questions in that area. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kayoko Okada.
Well, thank you very much for a very warm introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight. I am very excited to be here tonight and to have this opportunity to tell you a little bit about my research. So I've been doing neuroimaging research now for about 10 years, and my focus has been looking at the neural organization of language. And today I will be focusing on what this system looks like in people who hear, who use speech, and people who are born deaf who use American Sign Language. Before I start, let me just say that I invite you to ask questions during my talk. You don't have to save it until the end. So if something is not clear or you have a question you'd like to ask, please feel free to interrupt at any point. All right, so let me first start by telling you that language is fascinating. When I first got to graduate school, I just wanted to study the brain. And I was not convinced that language was the right system to study this in. But now, having been doing this for about 10 years, I have learned that language is highly complex and very interesting. It is also a uniquely human ability. And I know some people might want to debate that, but I would consider it to be uniquely human. In addition to that, it is a system that for many of us, we just take for granted. Right now, I'm speaking, and you are hopefully very fluidly just understanding what I'm saying. And when you want to chit-chat with your friends, you don't think too hard about the precise word that you need to articulate. You don't think about how to map that onto motor representations. It's very fluid for you. And it's really not until you lose the ability to communicate in some way or know somebody who's lost the ability to communicate that you really give it some thought. In addition to that, children all around the world, by the time they're about the age of 5, acquire linguistic competence. So little kids are pretty good little talkers by the time they're 5. If any of you have kids, you know that they're not always the best listeners. Maybe that comes later. I'll have to study that. But they are linguistically competent. And what is really remarkable about this is that you don't actually have to teach children how to speak or how to understand. Simply by exposure and social interaction, they naturally acquire their native language. So the question that I've been asking is, how does our brain do this? What are the neural systems that support this amazing ability that we have? So we're going to go back in history just a little bit because it's fairly informative. The first clues came from the work of Paul Broca in the 1800s. Broca had a patient named Tauntaun. His real name was Leborn, but in the literature he's known as Tauntaun because that's all Broca could say. That's all that Leborn could say was time. He also knew some French swear words, but that was it. And when he died, the autopsy revealed that he had a very large lesion in his inferior frontal cortex in the left hemisphere. So then Broca went to a scientific meeting and said, "We speak with the left hemisphere." And this had a profound effect because he was a very renowned scientist. And so people started thinking that specific cognitive systems can actually be localized in the brain. Now, for those of you who don't know what Brocas aphasia is, this is a syndrome where the patients have tremendous difficulty expressing speech, expressing language, I guess I should say. So they have the ability to comprehend. They're also cognitively aware of everything that is going on, but they're unable to express their thoughts. So this is a very frustrating condition to have. So here's a video of a Brocas aphasic. This patient just finished describing the picture over here. The picture over here is a classic neuropsychological test. You would ask the patient to basically describe what you see. Just tell me what you see in this scene. Let's see if this will play. Oh no. Oh, shoot. Oh, what does it say there? Oh, can we give it permissions? No. Oh, no. Okay. So some of my videos won't work today. All right. Well, let me try and describe it for you. This is a patient who is trying to say boy and girl, pictured over here. And the patient has tremendous difficulty in the way he says it is boy, okay, or girl, okay? It's very hard for the patient to get the words out, even though if you speak to the patient, he understands exactly what is going on and what is being asked of him. Actually, let me go back to Brocas aphasia for a moment. So what we've learned from neuropsychology is that a lesion in the left inferior frontal cortex produces Brocas aphasia. So the question then is, if a person is deaf and uses sign language, where is the lesion in these patients when they present with Brocas aphasia in the manual modality? Okay, and so there are Brocas aphasics who use sign language, and their sign output is affected in the same way that a Brocas aphasic here is affected. So I'm not going to answer the question yet, and you don't have to answer it either, but it's just something to think about. If we know that inferior frontal cortex damage produces Brocas aphasics in hearing people, well, where's the damage in people who sign? So one thought was, well, perhaps the damage is in the right hemisphere because of the fact that people who use sign language, they're using the manual motor system, and it's also visual motor. And the right hemisphere is more dominant in visual spatial processing. So there were some hypotheses out there that, well, maybe the damage would be in the right hemisphere. Okay, and I'm going to leave it at that for now. We'll come back to it. Something to think about. All right, next came Wernicke's patient who had a large lesion in the left temporal cortex. And this patient, although you won't be able to see the video, in Wernicke's aphasics, what happens is that these patients have fluid speech output, which is unlike Brocas aphasia, but when they speak, they're not making any sense. Okay, so it's like word salad, just a bunch of gibberish. In addition to that, when you try to work with these patients and you try to give them instruction, like point to the ceiling, which is the video here, the patient will sit there and say, the ceiling, yes, the ceiling. So it's like she's getting some semantics, but she's not really able to follow directions. So there's something going on with the semantic system in Wernicke's aphasia. And the lesion here is in posterior temporal cortex. Now, we can ask a similar question in American Sign Language. Where is the lesion location in people who sign, who suffer a stroke and can no longer understand sign? Okay, so they can see okay, but they can no longer comprehend sign language, right? It's exactly what's going on here. This patient can't understand by listening, and for people who have sign language, they can no longer understand sign by seeing. Okay, so where's the lesion location in these patients? All right, and I'll leave you with those questions. Now, back in the time of Wernicke and Broca, to understand what was going on in the brain, you had to wait for somebody to die, and then you would do an autopsy. But today, with the advent of neuroimaging, we know a lot more about brain function because we can actually study the healthy brain at work today. So many of you can come and participate in my fMRI experiments, and we can watch your brain working. So it's really revolutionized the way we study the human brain. So what you see up there is we can study speech perception. We can also study human memory. We can study the visual system. We can also study infants now and look at developmental changes as their vision develops, as they acquire language. So there's a lot that we can do with neuroimaging today. So here's an example related to language. This is an fMRI experiment where it's actually my husband listening to human speech, which would be my voice. And I actually did pop him in the scanner before we got married. And I said, well, I just want to know what your brain looks like. And I want to make sure that there's good auditory response when I'm talking to you. And there you see that there's nice auditory responses bilaterally. Well, you see the nice bilateral auditory response in his brain. So that's the kind of work that you can do. And this also corroborates what we know from neuropsychological data, that the temporal lobes are involved in perception. And here's an example from speech production. This was a speech production task where people are articulating a sequence of words. And there's nice activation here in the frontal cortex and parietal cortex and posterior temporal lobe. And again, corroborating the neuropsychological data that Broca's area is engaged in speech production. So many of you, and many of my students, you see these MRI images, and you see these heat maps in the brain and blobs. You say, oh, good, that brain area is involved. Okay, but what are these brain areas? What exactly am I measuring? Since the rest of the studies that I'll be talking about use fMRI, and fMRI is my research tool, I thought I should spend a minute explaining what exactly it is that I'm measuring. fMRI is a hemodynamic method, or blood-based method. It is an indirect measure of neural activity. It's indirect, not direct. So for example, single unit recording would be direct because you're actually listening in on an action potential being generated. Now this is very different. So basically the fundamental assumption here is that if a particular brain area is working very hard, it is going to recruit metabolic resources to that area. So there's blood flow to that area. And not only that, it's not really like the velocity of flow, but it's actually oxygenated blood that is being carried into that part of the brain. And as it gets deoxygenated in the capillary bed, it is that difference between oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood that gives rise to the measurable signal. So that's exactly what we are measuring. It's not, we're inferring that there's neural activity going on that is recruiting more blood and oxygen to that area, but it's still an indirect method. Also, what you see up here, circled in the little cube in the brain, that's called a voxel. So what we do in imaging is we take the brain, and if you chop it into 3Ds, you get these little cubes, and each cube is called a voxel. And what we're asking is, if you present the subject with a task, so for example here, my husband was hearing speech for 10 seconds and then silence for 10 seconds, speech for 10 seconds and silence for 10 seconds. I'm asking the question of which voxels in the brain correlate with my task. Okay, so I will be doing an analysis on each voxel. I extract the signal from each voxel, and then I ask, well, does the response in this voxel, is it tracking the stimulus? If it is, well, it cares about the stimulus, and if not, it doesn't care, it's doing something else. Okay, so that's kind of what we're looking at here. Any questions so far? All right. Okay, so the rest of my presentation is divided into two sections. The first section is short. I wanted to start by describing a very influential language model, which is called the dual stream model. This model, if you go to a language science conference, this model is the one that is most discussed, and data are interpreted within the context of this model, and it's very, very influential today. It is also the model that has guided my work for the last decade, so I thought it was a good starting point. And after I describe this model, I will be talking about the dorsal network of this model. Okay, so this model, called the dual stream model, it's dual stream because there are two streams. One stream that's involved in speech production, and the other stream that's involved in speech comprehension, the ventral network. And the ventral network I won't be discussing today, but I will be discussing the dorsal network, which is involved in speech production. And even though I say it is involved in speech production, if we actually ask the question of what is speech production, it's actually a perception-production interaction. And the reason for that is because for us to be able to speak, we need to know what we want to speak. And for those of us with hearing, that would be an auditory representation. So we have to start with an auditory representation and then map that onto a motor representation. And so we call these perception-production interactions. And that is an important property of the dorsal network. So I will be talking about a couple of experiments looking at the dorsal network. One experiment in speech, one in American Sign Language, and then some preliminary data looking at American Sign Language and gestures, so gestures that are used non-linguistically. All right, so the dual stream model. So for the dual stream model, we have two streams, right? The the dorsal network and the ventral network. And what you see here, there's the sound to meaning pathway, which is the ventral network. Ventral means belly. And that engages two brain areas down here. The first is the superior temporal gyrus bilaterally. That's in the temporal lobe. And basically, this is the area of the brain that is taking in sounds as you hear things, speech, music. So it's taking in speech here. And then behind that, we have the sound to meaning interface. So once you take in sound representations, you need to map that onto some kind of semantic representation in order to be able to understand language. And that is a part of the ventral network, the sound and meaning pathway. Okay. In that, again, I won't say too much more than that, but what I will be talking about is the dorsal network, which is inferior frontal gyrus here by Brocas area, shaded in purple. And then, again, we need to start with the sound representations in order to be able to speak. So that engages part of the red area in superior temporal gyrus. And importantly, there has to be a connection between the two systems if we are to speak. Okay. So what I've spent some time looking at and characterizing is this sound to motor interface, the green area there, and we call that area SPT. And it stands for Sylvian Parietal Temporal because of its location in the brain. If you trace the Sylvian fissure all the way back, it's where the parietal and temporal cortices come together, so it's named area SPT. So that's that will be the focus of my talk today. So here's another, a slightly more updated version of the model. Again, the ventral stream, which is the sound to meaning pathway, and the dorsal stream, which is the sound to action pathway. I guess I'll tell you one interesting thing about this model. It was proposed in 2000 by Hickok and Popple, and it's gained a tremendous momentum since then. But what's interesting to me about this model is the fact that when they first proposed this framework, it had tremendous difficulty getting this work published. And so it took a number of years. This paper got rejected all over the place initially. And the reason for that was because they had this assumption that's a part of the sound and meaning pathway, that perception is bilateral, so that our ability to understand language occurred in both hemispheres. And I guess people did not like that idea because for a long time people thought that language is in the left hemisphere. So I'm here to tell you today that language is not strictly in the left hemisphere. Your ability to speak, so the dorsal pathway that we'll be looking at, that does live in the left hemisphere. But when it comes to your ability to understand what is being said and to hear the words that are being said, it is actually bilateral in both hemispheres. And because of that, it took a number of years to get published, but now we know there's solid evidence that perception is bilateral, and many aspects of this model has been strengthened by data. Okay, so the dorsal stream, the sound action pathway, this is the pathway that, that is a part of your production pathway, and this is also the pathway where we have these sensory motor interactions, and this pathway is left dominant. And we'll want to keep this model in mind because one of the things that I've done with the ASL data is to ask the question of, we know what the dorsal network looks like in hearing people. We have these auditory and motor interactions, sensory motor interactions occurring. But for people who are using visual manual modality, what would the model look like? It may not look just like this, or does it look like this? It's an open question. All right, so perception and production interactions. So why do we need such a system? You know, I'm running around, I've spent 10 years studying perception, production, interactions. Well, somebody might say, how do you know it even exists, right? You're just hypothesizing this exists. Well, we know we need this system because in speech development, if a baby is to learn to talk, the baby has to have auditory representations first, so the baby has to hear. So we know this circuit has to exist and is very active in development. Also, if you wanted to learn a new vocabulary or if you wanted to learn a new language, you have to have a sensory representation of the word that you're trying to imitate, right? And then you map that onto meaning. So we know that this circuit must exist. It also exists in adulthood because we know that when people become deaf later in life, then these people will experience articulatory decline because of the fact that they are not getting their own speech feedback. Okay, so we know that this system is still going strong even in adulthood. So Carl Wernicke, a long time ago, had actually hypothesized back in his day that these perception production systems must be linked up. And he even had an anatomical site. He said it's probably posterior temporal lobe where these systems are linking up. And he was actually the first person who developed a neuroanatomical model of language back in the 19th century. And so here is his first model. And he said that basically perception and production systems have to be linked up. Fast forwarding to the year 2000, or 1999, Pat Kuhl is a very prominent speech perception language scientist, and even she recognized that even though it is very important that perception and production systems are linked up, we don't really know that much about how this is happening in the brain. So why is that? Why is it that we failed to understand this link? Part of it was that people were studying, scientists, if they were interested in perception, they were just studying perception. And if they were interested in production, they were just studying production. But nobody ever sat there and thought to study them together. So here you see an fMRI experiment from the year 2000, one of the earliest neuroimaging studies, single word perception, and you see nice bilateral auditory activity. And then next to it, you see a speech production experiment conducted by Haycock and colleagues. And, you see frontal cortex, you see parietal areas, you see visual because they were object naming. And so people were studying these systems separately, but not many people were studying them together. But Haycock actually, taking this study, noticed that there was an area in posterior temporal cortex. This is the area that Wernicke hypothesized was there. And he found that this temporal area, which is an auditory area, was lighting up or engaging in single word production. And I guess I should tell you that in single word production here, the way it was done a long time ago, it was silent production. So people are not overtly articulating, but they're silently articulating. So they're naming objects like, if it's a dog, they'd say, okay. And now the reason why I tell you that is because if people were overtly articulating and you see auditory activity, well, that's not very interesting. That's expected. But here, people are silently articulating, and yet you see an auditory area engage. So this seemed like a good candidate for perception production interactions. And therefore, this area got included into the dual stream model. So a little after that, I came along. Yes.
Can I ask a clarification question?
Yes.
Just to make sure I understand.
Yeah.
Something. So even if the person in the fMRI, there's no auditory input, and yet the auditory area is lighting up just by producing the word. Okay.
Yeah. So, for example, if you talk to yourself, your auditory cortex is listening. Yeah. Yeah. Good question. Any other questions? Okay. So shortly after this, I came along and I said, well, why don't we look at perception and production in individual subjects and see if we can map out this perception production link? So I ran an fMRI experiment where we actually presented subjects with a perception task and a production task and looked for overlap of these two systems. So it's a fairly simple design where subjects here during the perception part of the experiment, they were presented with simple objects like you see here. There's book, there's cake, and the subject would just lay in the scanner and the brain would be scanned while the subject would hear book and cake as the object is being presented. They didn't have to do anything, they were just listening to the words. And then during the production phase of the experiment, the subject would now see book, and now they'd have to silently name book. So they would say in the scanner while their brains are being scanned. And so each participant participated in 2 sessions of perception and production. And then I mapped the brain areas that were involved just in perception and just in production. And then I looked for areas of overlap in each participant. And what we found was this posterior temporal area where the green hatch mark is, that's area SBT, and also the area in the dorsal network that is participating in this production perception link. Okay, so we actually we were able to map this in all of our subjects. Yeah, question back there. Yes, so we actually did a study where people are imagining without actually moving, and we do see this part. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, yeah. One thing I will say about that I thought was very interesting is if people imagine speech without the motor articulators, you will see this area SBT light up, where the green hatch mark is. But what you don't see is very strong auditory. You see some auditory activity, but not strong. So basically, if you're thinking to yourself, you see some auditory activity, but not a lot. But if you now engage your motor articulators, then now, even if there's no direct auditory input, you see auditory cortex engage. Yeah. That's a good question. I don't know. That is a good question. Yeah. I don't know. Do you think it would? Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, right. Yeah, I would agree with you. Yes, I would think so. Yeah. Okay, so the conclusions of this experiment are that we found this area of the brain, area SBT, that seems to be involved in linking perception and production. This is a site that's involved in both input and output language functions. Following up on this study, I did a series of experiments with some colleagues characterizing this area in multiple different ways. And it's fairly well established that, you know, this is the brain area that's probably linking perception and production in hearing people. So the next interesting question with this was for people who don't have speech or hearing, and they're using sign language and they're born deaf, what does their neural system for language look like? So in their case, input and output is very different, right? Input is visual, not auditory. Output is manual. It's not by our mouth, tongue, vocal tract. So if input and output varies in this population, what does language look like in these people? So that was the next study. So there were 2 goals with this study. One was basically to map out perception and production separately in people who have American Sign Language, and then look for areas of overlap in the same way that we did with the first study. So we had 16 volunteers who were recruited by the Salk Institute, and these were all volunteers who were born deaf to deaf parents who learned American Sign Language from birth in the same way that a hearing child would hear speech sounds after birth. Okay. So these are Native American Sign Language volunteers. Okay. And it took a long time to run because it was hard to recruit that many people with this characteristic. So our participants participated in 2 tasks while their brains were scanned. So there was a perception task and there was a production task. And so for the production task, these volunteers were shown video. So the video would be like a tennis racket, okay, or somebody swinging a tennis racket or bouncing a basketball. And their instruction was to name the action. And so they would name racket or name, or they would sign, right, a basketball. Now, for the perception condition, they would see the same videos now. So it would be a person hitting a tennis racket. But now this was followed by the sign for a tennis racket. And then the participant would have to say whether that was a match or a mismatch. So if it was not a tennis racket, it was signed for something else. So it was a production task and a perception task. So here's what their brain response looks like, the activation pattern when our volunteers are doing the matching task. You see some frontal activation, you see some parietal and posterior temporal, lots of visual activation, but that's not terribly surprising because they're watching videos. And here is their activation pattern related to naming or producing. And so when they are generating the sign for racket or basketball, you see lots of frontal activation and also lots of parietal activation and, again, visual cortex. Yes? The matching, no. So for the matching, they just had to push a button. If the sign that followed the video was semantically a match or not a match. Yeah, so they were just pushing buttons. Yes. So just viewing. Okay. Okay, so let's first look at the neural areas that are engaged in perception in sign language and in hearing people, because people always want to know, you know, what's the same, what's different. So we can draw this comparison now. So what you see here on the left side are people, this is perception, so people who use American Sign Language who are viewing signs, and to the right are hearing people who are listening to speech. So the similarities that we see are in some of the language areas, for example, Brocas area, inferior frontal gyrus, also posterior middle temporal gyrus, that is a language area. Back here is Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is kind of a big area. It is posterior middle temporal gyrus back here is Wernicke's area. And you see that in both ASL and in speech. What is absent in sign language is the auditory response that hearing people that you see in the speech condition. And that's not terribly surprising, right? Because they were born deaf. But what you do see is a large visual response in ASL compared to speech. So really the main difference here are in sensory areas, okay, in the input areas. Okay, what about production? Now, production looks remarkably similar. I mean, if you just show me, you know, one from the left side and one from the right side, by looking at that, wouldn't be able to tell you if it was somebody who was signing or somebody who was speaking. Like, I wouldn't be able to tell. It's not to say there aren't differences. In the literature, there are. But there are more areas of commonality than there seem to be differences. So let's come back to the question that I asked originally, which is, and now you probably know the answer, but if there's somebody with Brocas aphasia who is a deaf signer, so this patient is presenting with expressive language problems, where's the lesion location? Is it in the right hemisphere, as some hypothesize, right hemisphere being dominant for visual spatial processing? Or would you guess that the lesion is in, say, Broca's area? Any guesses? Broca's area. Based on the imaging data, you'd probably guess that it was Broca's area. And that is the case. What we notice is that the lesion locations, when people who sign present with Brocas aphasia, the lesion tends to be in the left hemisphere, in the left language area, which is Broca's area. And this is also, I don't have a figure for it, but I'll also say that for people who have Wernicke's aphasia who sign, the lesion location is in posterior temporal cortex, where Wernicke's area is. It is not in visual cortex. Okay. So the other question we had related to this study is, what about this perception-production interaction? Because whether you hear or are deaf, regardless, your two linguistic systems have to connect. So perception and production has to connect. So where is this connection in people who use sign language? And so I took the two maps, the perception map and the production map, and we overlaid it together. And what we found is inferior frontal gyrus, so Broca's area, and a site in parietal cortex. My pointer is weak today. It's the area in parietal cortex up here that is active. And this is a part of the dorsal network from the original model. So this is the perception production overlap network, the sensory motor interaction. And this actually makes good sense because work from the visual domain have found that visual motor integration, so integrating your sense of vision with the motor system, engages the parietal cortex. There's also additional evidence coming from animal work that the parietal cortex is very much interested in doing these visual motor integration functions in primates. So the fact that for people who use sign language, they are doing a visual manual motor task, it makes perfect sense that their integration site or their connection site would actually be up in parietal cortex. So back to our original model where we started. Up above, you see the original model for spoken language. We have motor representations that sit in Broca's area. We have sensory representations that sit in auditory cortex. And then you have area SBT at the end of the Sylvian fissure there that is doing the sensory motor connection. Area SBT there. Now, down below, you have sign language. You still have motor representations in Broca's area, but now you have sensory representations in visual cortex, okay, because their input is vision. And now when it comes to the interface, it is in parietal cortex doing the linking between the two systems. So that's what the model we think looks like in those who use sign language. So the conclusions. Basically what we found is that the neural organization for language is very similar between deaf and hearing populations. So what that says is language is language. Language as a cognitive system is living or occupying in specific neural regions. And so it doesn't matter what the input or output is, language is a system in itself, living in certain neural territories. Now, the additional thing that we did here is we mapped out the dorsal network in people who use American Sign Language, which includes Broca's area in inferior frontal gyrus and parietal lobe, an area in parietal lobe. So now, what is this area doing? We think basically what this area is doing is taking the sensory representations and transforming that or mapping that onto some kind of motor representation so that you can express language. Now I'm going to stop you for a second and ask the question of why do we care about this? So I've spent a long time looking at this area, and I look at it because I just find it interesting. Okay, but I know for the audience, like it in itself may not seem all that interesting, right? I've been looking at this little area. So the question is, why should you care, the general public care about this tiny little brain area? Yes, you all have this area, and it does an important function for you. But in addition to that, it has some, our understanding of this area has some clinical implications. So, for example, for people who stutter, we think that there is a dysfunction of this area. And so for people who stutter, we think that this particular area that is linking perception and production, that is basically keeping track of auditory representations and helping with the motor output. Maybe it's a timing issue. Maybe there's something about the feedback that is going wrong. But there's some evidence that this area is involved. Also, there's been some new research in this area that I think is really fascinating. And this connects to developmental dyslexia, or children with a learning disability. So this particular brain area that we're looking at, SBT, if you look at the gray matter in this area, it seems like the neurons in this area are not fully developed, or they're a little bit smaller in size in children who have a family history of dyslexia. And so what some folks at Harvard have done is they've actually imaged children who are not yet reading. So these are like 4-year-olds or 5-year-olds. And most 4- and 5-year-olds don't read. But these children had a family history of dyslexia. And when the researchers did an anatomical scan of their brains, they found that this particular area was smaller in kids with a family history of dyslexia. Now, this is kind of interesting because if we can characterize this area and understand it better and link it to some other areas of research, this could help identify kids that are at risk. And so for children who have reading problems, sometimes they're not identified until they're like in 2nd grade or 3rd grade or worse, much later than that. And what we know today is that early remediation programs can really benefit kids. And so if we can actually identify them much early on, then we can actually help them much earlier, and perhaps, they would have a better experience in school and facilitate their learning. So why should we care? There are larger implications. But of course, for me, it was just a scientifically interesting question. Okay, moving on. When we were doing this work with American Sign Language, there was an interesting question that came up, which is that, and this is preliminary work that I'll be presenting. So people who sign, they use the manual motor system linguistically, right, as language, but they also gesture, and the gestures are non-linguistic. So in one case, they're using the hands. It could be linguistic, non-linguistic. So what does this look like in the brain if they're using ASL linguistically versus gesturing? Are there differences in the brain, or are there more commonalities between these two systems than we think? So we decided to do this study. We had 15 volunteers who were recruited by the Salk Institute. And again, these volunteers were deaf at birth and also exposed to American Sign Language as babies. Okay. So in this study, and too bad the videos won't work, but these were videos of either American Sign Language or gesturing, but semantically similar, congruent. So here's a person that was signing mirror linguistically, and then this person was gesturing with a mirror, looking at herself. And again, there was a perception phase of the task and a production phase of the task, and all volunteers were scanned while they were watching these videos. And for the perception task, they would be shown the video of of say ASL for mirror, and then this was followed either by an identical video or a different video, and all they had to do was push a button to indicate whether the videos were the same or not. And now for the production task, they would be shown the video, and then they had to either repeat the sign or repeat the gesture. Okay, so that was a production task. Now, here's the overlap for gestures and ASL. To the left, you have perception. To the right, you have production. There's a couple of things that's interesting about this, which is that there's a lot of areas of overlap. And in perception, you see this area in posterior supratemporal sulcus. Okay. That is, part of it is Wernicke's area. Okay, so when people are perceiving gestures and perceiving sign, they are having a semantic, they're mapping this with a semantic representation, so that makes sense. In addition to that, a part of that is a biological motion perception area. And so, for example, have you seen like point light displays? These are like little lights that are on screen, and then it looks like a person is walking or skiing, these point light displays. And if you show people point light displays, you see this area engage. Now, for production, we see basically many of the language areas. So you are seeing frontal cortex, and also that little area in parietal cortex is popping up again. This is our sensory motor site in parietal cortex that is showing up. Now, you might be wondering, well, what about the differences? So it turns out that our preliminary analysis did not yield any linguistic specific areas. And that's not to say these areas don't exist. These areas might exist. Well, they probably, as a matter of fact, I believe that they do exist. But sometimes it is the case that in group analyses, small brain areas, small differences get washed out. So basically what I'm doing now with the data set is looking at each participant carefully in each of our ROIs and looking at the signal in each participant to see if we can see any differences between gesturing versus using ASL linguistically. So that's next, and it's something that I'm currently working on. All right, so to conclude, what have we learned? We've learned that the neural organization for language is similar in speech and in American Sign Language. And when it comes to sensory motor interactions, we have the dorsal network that's engaged in hearing people, and we've also been able to map out the dorsal network in American Sign Language. When it comes to ASL versus gestures, well, there seems to be a common network in the brain for sure. And when it comes to some of the differences, it might take a little bit of work to tease out what's going on. Now, my next question is, I've been looking at this dual stream network and how language is organized in the brain for a little while. And I'd really like to try and understand, how does this network change? How do the connections between these brain areas change as we learn another language? So for example, not being bilingual, but if you decide you want to go out and learn Russian, you are now tapping into that language network, but you're you're learning another language. How does this network change with learning? In addition to that, we know there are tremendous benefits of cardiovascular exercise on memory function. There's neurogenesis in hippocampal neurons. There's so many benefits, and I don't just say it because I love it personally, but there's good science to support that regular exercise is beneficial to brain function. So what I'd like to do is try and understand what are the benefits of aerobic exercise on learning and language learning generally. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Professor. We do have about 5 or 10 more minutes for any Q&A that needs to take place. I know there's a couple of questions in the audience. I'll walk around with the microphone just to make sure that the video recording system captures your question. Here you go, Carol.
So I'm curious now. I have a friend, the couple, neither was born deaf, but both are severely bimodally impaired, and they had a child who was also not born deaf, but was born very severely bimodally impaired, and first experienced sign language as a communication or gestures, and then maybe by like 3 months was aided. And so they've always done simultaneous vocal and signing. So that child is now 3, and he does that too. So does he just use more of his brain than we do? I mean,
maybe. That's a hard question. I don't know. One thing I will tell you about the sign language data is that I did focus a lot on the commonalities, because I think the intuition for some people is that because input and output is so different between speech and ASL, that the language system itself might look different. But there are some differences, and that is that for people who use American Sign Language, they tend to recruit their right hemisphere more in some language tasks, and it's not clear why that is. And in addition to that, there are some differences in terms of when these people started signing that correlates with how much they use the right hemisphere. And exactly what to make of that, like, I'm not really sure yet, but that's what the data looks like. Yeah.
So I have a question that's maybe sort of similar. It's twofold. One, I guess, have you thought about doing work with CODA? So hearing children of deaf adults who are exposed to both auditory language and sign language. But also, I guess my question is, what do you make of the fact that many children, even hearing children, are able to learn sign language before they're able to learn spoken language?
Right. That's a good question. To answer the first part, to work with a special population is really difficult. I would love to, but it's not on the horizon, possibly. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know exactly why it's so much easier for kids to learn sign language, and maybe somebody else here would know. One thing I've always wondered about is we know that your mouth, your tongue actually develops over time. So, for example, you're born, you have a short tongue, and it actually elongates and develops through use and through development, which gives you the ability to speak the way you do now. And in some kids who have speech production problems, part of it has to do with the development of the tongue and coordination. And so it might be that some of these, maybe we're not developed quite yet, whereas maybe the manual system is a little bit easier. But I don't know, maybe somebody else has a different answer to that.
Okay. I just have a question. So if the SPT is the spot, I remember we called it that last semester.
Yes.
If the SPT is damaged later on in a hearing person's life, what should we expect? Will they lose their ability to speak or no?
That's a really good question. No, so what happens is if you damage that part of the brain, you get something called conduction aphasia. And so for people with conduction aphasia, their primary deficit is in repeating. So if I do a repeat after me kind of task, you make a lot of phonemic paraphasias, which are sound-based errors in production. So if you look at speech errors that are made by phasics, it's actually very revealing. And so for people with damage in this back part of the brain, when they're trying to repeat, they're doing something with the sound representations that's not quite right. So a lot of the errors are sound-based. And so that was some of the evidence that we took into account when this model was developed to say, we know in conduction aphasia, maybe there's something wrong with linking the sensory with the motor representations, and that's why, you know, they can comprehend okay. Their output is not so affected like Brocas aphasia, but when they do get output, there's tons of sound-based errors. Yeah. Good question.
Back to the previous question, right here.
Oh, yes, yes.
Back to the previous question about, what was it that you asked? I can't think of it now. Oh, do you think it's possible that because babies naturally, you know, they find their feet first, or they find their hands first, or they find like bodily functions, do you think that could be a reason why they naturally pick up sign language quicker than they actually pick up language? Because it's like a self-discovery kind of,
Right.
like with their bodies
Yeah,
first?
actually, Nora has an answer to that. Nora, yes.
Lifespan developmental.
Yes, please.
The issue is actually, the question is actually in line with what you've been presenting, which is comprehension of language. You know, speech production and saying a word is tied to this physical, but the comprehension, when we teach them sign language, they have that capacity. It's like a motor issue in terms of speaking. So you can teach the 1-year-olds how to sign. Right. They'll be still limited, like one-word answer kinds of things, but it is a developmental aspect of like once their body sort of catches up, the speech production comes. Right, so they're not more, they can't do advanced sign language, you know, they're still doing this one word, yeah, exactly, yeah, scary, that sort of thing.
Do you think that there would be like significant differences for the processing and production with deaf people that can actually speak and like can like read lips versus deaf people that they just communicate with other deaf people through sign language?
So are there differences? My guess would be there's more commonality than there are differences. And if you look at audiovisual speech, so for people who are lip reading, you still see a lot of the same language areas that are engaged.
Like, do you think that would be similar with like when people that are hearing, they learn sign language versus like people that are deaf learning basically how to communicate through speech?
So would the language network look the same?
Yeah.
Absolutely, I would think so, yes. Yep. Yeah.
I'm actually just curious about the backstory. Like, how did this first land on your radar as something to pursue as a research interest?
So how did I get, well, so the honest answer is, so I was over at Johns Hopkins. I started my graduate work there, and I actually started out in mathematical modeling. So doing just lots and lots of math. And sometimes as students, right, we don't know exactly what we're getting into. So I enjoyed psychology as an undergrad, you know, did well in my classes. And I took a lot of math classes just because I liked it. And so not knowing exactly what I wanted to do, I went to Johns Hopkins and I worked with somebody who was doing mathematical modeling. And it was around that time that neuroimaging was becoming really big, and it was very close to NIH. And NIH folks were doing some really interesting work looking at brain function. And so I was in a graduate seminar and just became totally fascinated with brain imaging. And I thought, wow, I'm taking all these advanced math classes and I don't really like them all that much. Studying the brain is far more interesting. And so coincidentally, my advisor at Johns Hopkins was moving somewhere else, and it was a good time, I think, for us to say goodbye. So then I came back to California and I contacted some folks who were doing neuroimaging, and I said, I'm very passionate about learning about the brain. This is really what I wanted to do. But I also had a passion for memory. And so I said, really what I want to do is study memory in the brain. And so my PhD advisor, Irvine, said, well, I don't know anything about memory, but I can teach you neuroimaging, but I study language. And I said, okay, well, I'll learn imaging, and you convince me language is interesting. What do you think? And now I'm indoctrinated, so, so here I am.
All right, any more questions? If not, with that, once again, can we please thank Professor Okada? I also wanted to thank Professor Marroquin for formally providing for tonight's formal introduction. I also wanted to thank my outreach department teammates, John Jackson, Ali, the student, Carol Raby at the back. For those students who showed up late and didn't get a chance to swipe into Leo, or AKA OrgSync, there is a director's chair in the back with a laptop, so if you want to get credit for attending tonight's event, please see Ali. And I also wanted to remind you that if you fill out the feedback forms, you will be entered into that raffle for the $100 Amazon gift card. And my outreach buddy, John, is going to talk to you about our next special event.
Yeah, so just very quickly, so we do 8 faculty pub nights a year. The next one is going to be on October 17th, and Sina Kramer from Women and Gender Studies is going to talk about her new publication, which is Excluded Within the Unintelligibility of Radical Political Actors. So the in and out groups within radical political organizations. So it should be pretty exciting. But our next event is actually going to be Thursday night here in this room. We do the opening reception for our Fall Archives exhibit. So if you haven't seen the exhibition about tales of mystery and imagination, please check it out. But we have an opening reception on Thursday at 5:30, and that's open to the entire LMU community, and the food and the wine will be flowing there as well too. So I hope you will join us.
Thank you. The feedback forms could be placed on the counter in the glass box on the left.